Hello, and welcome to Zoom and Czarny. I'm Dustin Czarny, Democratic Elections Commissioner for Onondaga County, and on this week's episode, I have Alec Lewis of McDonnell and Associates. We actually recorded this a couple of weeks ago, right after the state of the state. It's a great conversation about state politics. Alec Lewis used to work for the New York Senate Democrats, and I got to know him there. He's a good friend. We have a great conversation about state politics in general, and it's something new that I've done here on Zoom with Czarny this year, so I'm really happy to have him on. I will be this week. We are back from our winter conference, and we are in our offices this week at the Board of Elections, getting ready to put out a new registration system. And also today, a draft, or not a draft, but a final political calendar has been released as well. You can see that on our website at onvote.net. And I have a lot of stuff going on, a lot to talk about. Usually January is pretty slow, but with the political calendar coming out, the transfer of our registration system, we're actually very busy in our office right now. So bear with us as we're changing over. We hope to be done with this whole transition by February 15th and be able to give all the data that we want. Now stay tuned for my conversation with my good friend, Alec Lewis of McDonnell and Associates. We talked about New York State politics, and enjoy. Bye-bye. And we're back. And I'm very happy to have my friend, Alec Lewis. Alec Lewis is currently with the O'Donnell and Associates lobbyist firm, but I actually know him going back to his days working with the New York Senate Democrats. And we're going to be talking about state politics today. Alec, thank you very much for coming on the program.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dustin, so much. And thank you for all the great work you do as the Onondaga Democratic Commissioner and in your capacity as well with the broader Election Commissioners Association representing the Democratic Commissioners.
I appreciate that. Well, and I want to thank you for being such a close ally over the last few years. Even though now you're in a new role, I know you're still working on behalf of Democrats. But why don't we introduce the audience to who you are? Who's Alec Lewis?
Sure. Well, at the end of the day, I'm a proud New Yorker now. I'm originally a Vermonter. I was born in California, but I grew up in southern Vermont. I moved to New York several years ago and spent the last 10 years working in the New York State Senate, working my way up to becoming our Deputy Director for Intergovernmental Affairs in the Senate Majority. It's been the honor of my life to have worked for Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins and Deputy Leader Senator Gianaris. Just two real people of profound integrity and leadership. And, as well, in addition to the government role that I had, which was a combination of intergovernmental work and also engaging stakeholders and activists, I was proud to oversee a really amazing legislative team that worked with a lot of our newer offices, specifically in helping their staffs and their members get up to speed so they could really hit the ground running. In addition to that, I was the former statewide field director for the New York Democratic Senate Campaign Committee for both the 2020 and 2022 election cycles. And we were very fortunate to secure a back-to-back supermajority, thanks to John Mannion and the great voters in Onondaga and Oswego, by a whopping 10 votes, landslide Mannion, as he's called now. And Dustin, of course, you are very familiar with that race and that outcome and that whole process. And I'm sure
I'm getting a little PTSD now that you're mentioning it. So, but yes, it was an interesting race. Yes.
Yep. Well, it was fun to be out there as well. During that recount process, and certainly you and your staff did yeoman's work to make sure that every ballot was counted that should be counted. And it's some really important work. I'm very good friends with many commissioners around the state, Democratic elections commissioners, and it's unbelievable the work that all of you do each and every day, not just during election season, each and every day to really safeguard the interests of democracy and the voters.
So we're talking, today about state politics. But before we get into that, you are in a new role. You're with O'Donnell and Associates. What is, that was a top 30 lobbyist firm, but what do you do? I think a lot of times people think of lobbyists and they think of people in the back rooms cutting deals to kill children, and so what are you doing with O'Donnell and Associates, and what does O'Donnell and Associates do?
Sure. So a lot of people have a sort of a negative connotation with the word, lobbyist. And, at the end of the day, a lot of the clients that we represent at our firm are small nonprofits. There are some businesses as well, and some labor unions as well that we represent. But there's all different types of organizations and entities that have lobbyists. And at the end of the day, lobbyists are there to educate elected officials and lawmakers on really what's going on the ground and in the communities. There's only so much information that any one person could know about any topic, let alone our elected officials. So that's really the work of a good lobbyist, is to educate elected officials of what is going on, to give them all the information that they can need. And then at the end of the day, it's up to the elected officials to act on that information in whatever way they see fit. Because I work directly in the legislature, all staffers and elected officials who serve in state government really have a 2-year ban on directly lobbying, that agency that they just came from. So I will not be, formally lobbying the legislature for the next couple of years. Certainly, I'll be involved in political activities, but I'll be, lobbying the governor's office and the executive chamber and agencies on different topics. But what O'Donnell Associates at the end of the day is a up and coming lobbying firm. The firm has been around for a few years, led by our managing partner Jack O'Donnell, who's an upstate guy. He's based in Buffalo, has done a lot of work for Hillary Clinton, for Chuck Schumer as well. And we have a great team, but we're a smaller firm, and we're particularly rooted in upstate, but we have a growing presence across the state as well as in Washington, D.C.
And that's interesting that you mentioned about the lobbyist ban on you cannot now. Can you not lobby the assembly either?
Both houses. It's both houses. And so in my role within our lobbying firm, I'm really focused on building a campaigns practice, and that's both meant for our existing clients to be smarter in how they're engaging in both the political campaign space and public affairs campaign space. But I'm also excited to hopefully work with various Democratic parties across the state and other types of candidates on various types, of campaign activities from soup to nuts, whether it's party building, infrastructure building, helping various communities across the state better understand how to run really good, effective field programs, organizing training, those types of things. So it's very new. It's in infancy. I'm in, a couple weeks in, but we'll also be engaging in research and, polling on different issues for different organizations as well. So I'm just really excited by the opportunity to really build this for myself within a firm that is newer, but has quickly grown, like as you mentioned, into a top 30 firm in New York State.
So we do want to talk about statewide politics, and you're banned from lobbying about talking about the Senate Democrats, but we can talk about Democracy Day, right? I mean,
we can absolutely talk about those bills. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We can talk about those bills. At the end of the day, they voted on them. Happy to talk about them.
So at the time of airing of this program 2 weeks ago, the New York State Senate passed, I believe, 16 bills, and then another 2 bills later on dealing with election reform. This is kind of a tradition that started when the Dems took over the New York State Legislature in 19. And, where on the first day of the legislature, they pass some forms of expanding democracy. And I just want to give you some space to talk about that tradition and maybe the particular bills that were passed, and why do you think the Senate Democrats focused on those?
Absolutely. So in full disclosure, in past years, I would be someone that would be very involved in crafting some of the, involved in some of the bills in this package. I worked on some past variations of bills to expand early voting and to tweak early voting in working in conjunction with our policy group and our council and finance teams. It's an important tradition that's been set by the leader and Deputy Leader Gianaris, but particularly the leader, because at the end of the day, the Senate Dems have really wanted to cement themselves as a conference as pro-voting and making it easier for people to vote fundamentally. Making early voting a reality in New York was one of the very first actions taken by the Senate majority when the Senate Dems took it over in 2019. A lot of the bills in this space in this year that sort of were acted on this year were bills. One bill carried by Senator May in your neck of the woods to establish portable polling locations, to combat voter suppression. At the end of the day, there's a couple bills I know carried by Senator Mannion, also from your neck of the woods, that would really reform the process of how boards of elections are staffed and to professionalize those offices as much as possible. There were some bills as well to address the practice of forum shopping that sometimes happens, where some borderline frivolous lawsuits have occurred in very specific counties that are very Republican. This would force those types of lawsuits to be originated in counties of jurisdiction that are more suited to handle those types of cases, appellate divisions and things like that as well. But a lot of these bills are common sense bills to advance the functionality of the boards of election across the state. And for example, even to clarify that, God forbid, there's long lines at certain polls. One of the bills that was in that package was to make sure that people can hand a voter a bottle of water so that they don't faint while standing in line. It's things as simple as that in some cases in this package.
Yeah, and that bill and a couple of others, I think the voter suppression bill that made voter suppression a crime, a specific crime in New York, that actually got bipartisan support, which is something that we have not seen in previous Senate sessions. So
a number of these bills got pretty strong bipartisan support. There were some other bills that were debated pretty heavily on the floor by the Republicans. The Republicans did debate particularly the forum shopping bill because they and they brought up concerns of certain voters in certain places. The idea that that someone in the North Country has to drive down to Albany, but in reality, you and I know as well as I do, these there's something called the telephone. There's email, and there's plenty of people that would happily file a lawsuit on behalf of somebody in Albany or Buffalo or New York City or other parts of the state.
They debated against the forum shopping bill because they forum shop. I mean, that's because they've been doing it. Going to Steuben County for the redistricting suit, going to Saratoga County for the absentee suit. They love to look for friendly judges at the Supreme Court level, which is the lowest court level, which causes chaos, and then hope that they can get a grand slam in the appellate court, which worked in the redistricting case, but not in the absentee case. But so, you're right. A lot more bipartisanship than before. But yes, the forum shopping bill, and at the time of us recording this, the minimum staffing bill has not been debated yet, but it will be by the time this airs. And I'm going to predict that that's going to be debated pretty heavily too. I was surprised they debated the SUNY CUNY statistical collection one so heavily. They were very much against that, and I didn't understand that. But
that one was a bit of a surprise as well. I mean, as somebody who has actively worked with all types of election data, that bill for me personally would be a godsend, and to many New Yorkers, because at the end of the day, the process of obtaining that data is extremely tedious. And while you and your board are very responsive and helpful for those types of requests, there are other boards that simply are not. And oftentimes that's just because they lack the infrastructure and the ability to do it. So Senator Myree's bill is a really important common sense bill to actually make it easier for boards and for regular New Yorkers to actually access election data. Because at the end of the day, democracy belongs to all of us, and that information is really important, that it's available easily for the public.
So getting on to the state of the state, another thing that happened, Democracy Day actually ended up a little bit early because they were running late and had to get to the state of the state. And that's why a couple bills were pushed off until the next week. But Governor Hochul gave the State of the State address on Tuesday the 17th. And let's just remember that this is a historical event. This is the first woman governor who's been elected on her own for her own term, standing before the legislature, giving a state of the state address. I think she did one last year after taking over for Cuomo the previous year. But again, she was filling a vacancy. She wasn't elected on her own. So, talk about that moment. I think it's pretty significant that a woman is leading our state that we think is a progressive state for the first time. This has been, done in many other states, but a woman is leading our state for the first time and standing before the legislature with, an African-American woman as a majority leader in the Senate and an African-American man as the speaker in the assembly. And this is really a marked difference from just a few years ago where it was three white men sitting up there. So what was that like for you as a Democrat to watch that, knowing that we're both white men ourselves talking about this, but that is what it is. But what was that moment like?
It was powerful. Like you said, it's historical. And I thought she rose to the occasion and gave a speech that really laid out a strong vision for the state. At the end of the day, the state of the state really is a kind of an interesting moment in New York in the annual process of happenings going on in the Capitol. That speech really needs to be both pragmatic, but also historical and sort of elevate the tone for what the year is going to be. And she really set out an ambitious agenda in terms of housing and public safety and mental health. But going back to your original question, at the end of the day, I think it's very important that all of the women and girls in our life are encouraged that there is no limit to what they can do. And having that glass ceiling broken of having the first elected female governor in New York is really important. And, she, along with Gretchen Whitmer and other sort of female leaders, it's also important because I think traditionally there's been this not bias, but there's been a lack of Democratic female governors across the country. So to have more Democratic female governors, as opposed to just senators or just members of Congress or legislators, it's also important to just, again, further the idea that women are leaders, women can lead, and women can most importantly be executives. And so she clearly demonstrated that she wants to set her own vision, set her own path forward. And I thought she took some steps to really try to separate herself as well from Andrew Cuomo, her predecessor, and really lay out her own vision for the state moving forward.
So let's get into the meat of the speech itself. She put out a lot of different tenets. The one that got the biggest play was the setting aside so many beds for psychiatric care, and it seems like it's mostly a public health platform that she has for this next year. Talk about some of the things that she laid out, and how likely are we able to accomplish them?
Sure. Well, I think a lot of what she laid out, the legislature is going to be relatively enthusiastic by. You've seen various statements by a lot of members, particularly in the Senate. I haven't seen as many of the Assembly member statements yet, but generally, let's start with housing. I mean, that is, she really was teeing up that issue as a big issue across the state, before her State of the State in late 2022. But the idea of building 800,000 units over the next decade is very ambitious. That she's laying out a lot of proposals within the New York Housing Compact, and that's a really good opportunity for labor and for developers and for other parties to kind of come together. Mental health, you talked about it. $1 billion investment is huge. A lot of the money that she's proposing would go to restoring and expanding mental health beds. We see it in our communities. There's a lot of folks who just increasingly feel like they have mental health issues. And there have been so many cuts to different resources over the last few years that I think this is very encouraging for a lot of providers and for communities to feel like there's more resources to take care of people who really are struggling with mental illness. And public safety. Now that issue is, bail and public safety issues are obviously very controversial in general. The changes that she's proposing to some of the bail language is certainly going to get a lot of debate within the Democrats and then the legislature. There are those who feel that there don't need to be any changes. There are some who feel like there need to be a lot of changes. But her approach, I think, will generate a lot of the conversation, certainly, and we'll have to see what the actual written language looks like in the executive budget. One proposal I was also really intrigued by was really her overall climate package. That I think a lot of the climate proposals have sort of been understated a little bit in the coverage, but this cap and invest program she's proposing, $200 billion in utility relief, even talking about the phasing out of fossil fuel buildings and that type of zero emission construction. It's a pretty ambitious plan. Again, I'm sure the legislature will look to add to it and build on it. I could keep going on and on and on, but just a couple other pieces are childcare. She also proposed expanding more resources into childcare. This was a big win within the budget last year to move closer to universal childcare. And another big issue for Democrats as well as the whole state is the idea of fully funding our schools. And her executive budget does propose fully funding foundation aid, closing sort of the end of the 3-year phase-in that the Senate Dems really have been pushing for years and were able to accomplish in the last couple of years, as well as expanding universal pre-K. So there's a lot of issues. And finally, minimum wage. She's proposed a bill that would index the minimum wage permanently to inflation. It's not quite as aggressive as a lot of the activists have been proposing, so I'm sure they will push a little harder to get it up faster. But at the end of the day, that is a change that is likely to be pretty well received by both business and labor groups, because business at the end of the day understands the reality of the cost of living in New York. Their frustration has always been the unpredictability of sort of the increases. So having it tied to inflation would help a lot of small business owners have more predictability and reliability and budgeting long term in terms of their workers.
So I want to focus in on some of these things. Yeah. Housing is something that is actually a big issue here in Central New York. We have Micron coming in. I'm sure you've heard about it. And supposedly it's going to bring 50,000 workers to Central New York. And the county executive, the governor, Senator Schumer all said that we need to increase housing here. But then recently, and I don't expect you to know this, but we do have a lot of NIMBY practices in our county. The town of Cicero, for example, just recently rejected a large-scale apartment complex because of the worry for traffic. But it does seem to me that Cicero is right in the Micron area. This is units that we would need for this big project to transform our county. Yet we're still fighting against these NIMBY practices by local boards. Is the governor, proposing any help in that area, or are we still going to be reliant on local control to give up some of these past zoning practices?
Well, those are really important questions and details that will hopefully be answered in the executive budget language. A lot of her proposals are based on the idea that certain there's sort of different structures that are different types of goals that would be targeted for different regions of the state based on where they are already in terms of on pace for building the types of new housing units that are called for. But there are various proposals that are outlined in her State of the State, which would likely supersede current local authority on a lot of these developments, precisely because oftentimes the roadblock to actually building more housing units has come at the local level. One of the proposals that she has is, again, to pursue the growth of ADUs. This is a similar proposal to what she had put in her executive budget last year which ultimately was dropped from the executive budget in the 30-day amendments, there was enormous political opposition, particularly on Long Island, to that proposal. Then her then primary opponent, Tom Suozzi, had really centered himself on that issue amongst others. So we're going to have to see what types of opposition comes from town supervisors and potentially local government groups who maybe not outright oppose some of these changes, but likely are going to want some level of tweaks when they see the language in the executive budget. But it's certainly a very ambitious proposal put out there by the governor.
And then, of course, what you closed on is minimum wage when you recapped earlier. And that actually kind of deals with, I know it kind of dovetails, ironically, with one of the bills that was recently passed in Democracy Day, which was about increasing the wage for poll workers at the polls to $300. And I was asked by a reporter on this, whether that's that's an unfunded mandate. Should we give funds to local counties? And I said, no, I think the problem is that the counties aren't given the money to pay subsistence wages to poll workers, which is their mandate, and that it has to come from the legislature to set a minimum scale. Because like here in Onondaga County, we pay our poll workers minimum wage. Well, minimum wage isn't what it used to be. And again, it is minimum wage, not, and we've had these large, substantial cost of living increases with inflation over the last few years. And that even the $15 minimum wage that we once thought of as pie in the sky is just pittance now. And upstate, it's not 15 yet. So are we looking at an initial hike and then tying it to the cost of living, or are we just tying it to the cost of living and then trying to catch up from there? Or are we waiting for the details on that?
We are waiting for the details on that. My reading of just, again, the State of the State book is that it sounds like this proposal would be more gradual and linked to CPI. But again, it depends on how it's written. Obviously inflation has been pretty high, in the last year or two, but in the past inflation was pretty low. So it's a question of, is it based year over year? Is it an average of a few years? Could there be, sort of a jump start to a higher wage and then have it phased in? There's a lot of different ways that, the final language could look like. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of different opinions and stakeholders on it, but we'll see what the governor's actual proposal is when the executive budget comes out in terms of the actual written language. And then I'm sure both the Senate and the Assembly will have a lot of things to say about it and likely propose alternatives within their one-house budgets.
And so now I want to kind of move a little bit away from state politics, if you branch out a little bit, because I do think, we're seeing this dysfunction in the House of Representatives, and a lot of people blame New York in the redistricting issue that brought in maybe 3 more Republican representatives than we should have had. Maybe even 4. And of course, one of those is George Santos. So, we're kind of responsible for that as well. What is your take on how we right this ship between now and 2024? You're a Democrat, you're a long-term Democrat, you're building a campaign platform. What are some of the things that you think New York Democrats have to do in these districts that will flip them back in 2024?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost, I mean, we have this whole fight going on and litigating, about, why New York or blaming redistricting. At the end of the day, good campaigns matter. And I think it's important to note that, the Senate Democrats held on to a supermajority. And, yes, we had a net loss of 1 seat. But at the end of the day, we actually lost. We did much better than our Assembly counterparts and in Congress. So, there need to take a step back and also realize that, the Senate Dem operation has been doing some different things that, hopefully the D-TRIP and the Assembly Dems can take advantage of. And one of the things that we really did prioritize was strong, effective field programs. I'm very proud of the work that we did with all of our campaigns to do that. And they made a critical difference in the elections. But that being said, I think we have to, at the end of the day, stop fighting about, who is to blame. At the end of the day, we're dealing with what we have. Who knows how much longer George Santos, or whatever his real name is going to be in Congress. We have to gear up for a potential special election, and we need to help whichever Democrat is the candidate in a potential special election, or if he rides out this term into a full term, we need to be focusing on retaking these districts. I live in the New York 19th. Mark Molinaro, who won very narrowly. That's certainly a race that's important to think about. These are important races, and at the end of the day, Democrats need to stop the infighting and focus on the bigger picture, which is taking back the House, and continuing to hold on to the Senate, and hopefully re-electing President Biden, assuming he runs again, and making sure we can actually enact real policies that help everyday New Yorkers.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I mean, I'm tired of like pinpointing why and who is at fault. And you're right. Look, when campaigns lose, you got to look at the campaigns first, and you have to say, hey, this is a lot on you. But then these districts that were drawn to be competitive districts. Like it or not, it was a Republican year. The Republicans won the national House race vote by, I think, about 3 or 4 points. That's not something that happened in 2018. It's not something that happened in 2020. I'm not even sure that happened in 2016. I think Democrats won it then, even though we didn't win the House. So that's important to point out. And yes, there may be a special election. We better gear up for that special election if there is. I saw that the House or that Long Island GOP leaders are calling on Santos to resign, and Santos has already rejected that resignation. Maybe by the time this airs, he will resign, but I don't think so. I think he's starting to cozy up with the MAGA wing of the party, and I actually don't think he'll lose a primary, because he will cozy up to that MAGA wing of the party and be able to win the primary in 2 years. But we'll see. But we do have to we do have to have good candidate recruitment. We have to have candidates that are raising money now and getting out there now, and but also we have to get together in those districts as well. And not, we could have healthy primaries, and that's fine. But after a primary, we better get together, because more is at stake than pointing the fingers at each other.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely. And it's also important to note that good candidates really matter. Look, John Mannion is a perfect example. John Mannion won what is a Republican district at the end of the day by 10 votes, granted, but he won a Republican district. And then in Southern Brooklyn, candidates like Yuen Chu and Jessica Scarcella-Spanton, they won in districts where they really outperformed other Democrats on the ballot. So, as we think about this, good candidates, basic messaging, fundamentally finding candidates that have a good story to tell and connect with actual voters is really important. And so whoever are the candidates for Congress, I hope that's a big thing that all of those campaigns are really thinking about, is finding good people who actually connect on a real way with everyday voters, because people are looking for authenticity, and people are looking to feel like they have elected officials that are truly representing them and serving their interests, both in Washington and in Albany.
Yeah, great points. Great points. Well, Alec, we're getting towards that end of this half hour that people start falling asleep. But I always like to end with my favorite question, which is, what haven't we talked about? What is something, totally random or on point or about you or anything else that you want to share with the listeners and viewers, or you want to discuss?
Well, I think one thing that maybe our listeners both don't know about us is that we're both theater guys. I think we both dabble with theater. I grew up in a union family of actors. Both my parents were in SAG-AFTRA and Actors Equity. I think there's a lot to be said for how, at the end of the day, I think my friend and former supervisor Lorena Moore joked with me that politics is just a bunch of failed theater nerds in terms of who are really the staffers and sometimes candidates, which is kind of true. But in all seriousness, I think it's important that both as candidates and campaigns, we think about again, it's not politics shouldn't be performance art. At the end of the day, there's elements of it that are always going to be, but the skill set that comes from understanding, how to connect with everyday people, storytelling, and connecting with people where they are is really important within campaigns. I guess the other thing we haven't talked about is the fact that Syracuse is such a great spot for cuisine. Every time I go to Syracuse, we have not talked about the Salt City Market, which is a must stop if you're ever in Syracuse, for all your listeners who are visiting Syracuse. And as someone who frequented Oswego during the ballot count for Mannion, highly recommend Steamers at the Clarion Hotel in Oswego. You can't go wrong with a fun night at Steamers.
It's funny. Yes. Although I am a former theater nerd now because I did retire. I retired from theater on February 29th, 2020, which was the best timing of my career because the next day COVID came and turned the entire theater community a mess. But I'm still supportive and praying for my friends that are in theater that they're recovering. It looks like theater's coming back finally, even at the community theater level. And that's it's needed. It's a vital part of our communities, the performance arts, and I look forward to them. And you're right. Absolutely, Syracuse has some of the best cuisine out there. I know because I partake in it every day. One of my favorite comments on Syracuse.com on an article when I was elected as commissioner. Of course, they run my picture and I'm a bigger guy. And they said, well, one of the commenters said, I'm always happy that when a fat man gets a raise because the restaurants are going to do well. And I couldn't even be mad because he was right. The restaurants did very well. Well, Alec, thank you very much for coming on Zoom with Czarny. Thank you for all your work. I hope to have you back again. This has been an excellent program. And thank you for all the work that you do.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dustin, for the opportunity. And thank you to all of you for watching and for all New Yorkers for continuing to believe in democracy.
And that was my conversation with Alec Lewis, a wonderful advocate and a good Democrat. And he's got an exciting new role with McDonnell and Associates. And I wish him very well there. This week, I'm back. I did a weekly wonk last week on Onondaga 2023. This weekend, I'll be doing a weekly wonk on the town's registration rates in Onondaga. A lot of interesting trends there, so check that out. Next week, my guest on Zoom with Czarny will be Christine Wood, a public citizen. She's come on a couple of times before. She's a democracy advocate, and we're going to talk about the federal the state of federal politics and how she's advocating in her role, knowing that we have a GOP Congress right now. So check out that conversation next week. And of course, on Tuesday, I'll be back with the commissioner in the car. So stay tuned and have a good day. Bye-bye.